Dungeons & Dragons is probably in its single most transitional moment in recent memory, and that includes the updated rulebooks and the OGL situation from a couple of years ago. While the OGL debacle could have led to a pivotal transition for the game, it didn't, and it was never really intended to either. It was just aggressively short-sighted greed, but that's a discussion for an entirely different video. Amazingly, this isn't also a video about the rise of other games like DC-20, Daggerheart, or Draw Steel, and I'm literally just noticing now as I'm writing this that all of these games begin with the letter D, just like Dungeons & Dragons. Conspiracy? Anyway, the question that this video is hopefully seeking to answer is whether or not D&D needs new classes and what, if anything, the departure of people like Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins might have to say about that. And before we continue, I'll pose the question to you right now. Do you think D&D needs new classes? Let me know in the comments. I'm very curious to hear what you all have to say. Also, thank you all for the incredible support over the last few weeks as I've been doing my best to get out both D&D and Daggerheart content. I've been having a blast with it, and it seems like a lot of you are enjoying it too. So if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button while you're there helps me so much more than you realize. Thank you so much. When 5e launched back in 2014, the game had 12 classes, the same 12 that we all know and love to this day. But that feels weird, right? Outside of the Artificer, which was released in Eberron Rising from the Last War and then revised in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we have seen exactly 0 other classes make it into official publication in what is now over a decade. What's weirder to me though isn't even as much that we've only had one new class be officially published, we've only had one other class even attempted through Unearthed Arcana, and that was the Mystic, which famously did not do that well, but that thing was revealed back in 2016. It's been over 9 years since we first saw it, and we're only just now getting its successor, the Scion, in 2025. The story of the Mystic is an interesting one though, since they were pretty damn non-committal about whether or not we would ever see the class materialize into anything real. At the time of the original UA, they said, "This effort is merely a first draft to gauge where we should start and what kind of approach to psionics in 5th edition would work best." The Mystic was nothing more than purely exploratory, which is quite fascinating to consider. Though we obviously don't know anything specific, I would be pretty confident in saying that there were plenty of other class ideas and concepts being tested internally that just never made it to UA. But the fact that the Mystic showed up at all, and their note that they were exploring the approach to psionics in 5e showed that the playtest was way less about the class itself, and way more about, as they said, psionics more broadly. What's important to remember is at this point in the life cycle of 5e, we didn't have any of the subclasses that we do now that embrace psionics like the Psi Warrior, Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, or the Soul Knife Rogue. These were all added years later, and if you look hard enough, you can see evidence of the Mystic in those subclasses too. So what we can gather from all this is that ultimately, the D&D design team has largely decided that an expansion of core classes is not at the forefront of their minds when they are considering new content for the game, but rather they have taken the approach that subclasses are the way to go. And while that may seem insignificant, the implications of it are quite significant. I want to be clear at this point that the core of this discussion is focused around 5e. Previous editions of the game had very different decisions regarding classes, like 3rd edition, which famously had like a trillion. Again, this isn't about that, it's about the design framework that 5th edition had established and what its future may or may not bring. So what are the advantages of choosing a class-focused system versus a subclass-focused system? In a system where you have an abundance of core classes, each niche will tend to be separated out into its own class with very little, if any, overlap. The degree to which this is true will largely depend on the system that you're playing though. Some games will have very strict barriers between classes that allow for essentially zero bleed over into anything. Some systems though may allow for multiclassing to get bits and pieces of different classes, and others will offer strict class systems but include things like shared perks or feats to pick from, and others will offer quote-unquote prestige classes that will allow you access to more specialized forms based on a set of prerequisites that you can meet from potentially any class. And honestly, that's just scratching the surface. There's plenty of ways that you can do class-focused systems. This was not the choice that was opted for with 5th edition though. Instead, they went the subclass route, with each class offering a plethora of different subclass options to choose from to not just flavor your character, but also influence the way that they play. By the end of its lifecycle, 2014 D&D had over 100 subclasses to choose from that enabled some degree of variation or playstyle from each other or their base class. The advantage of subclass systems are that they give the designers a lot more control over what is actually possible in a given system, and allows them to create specific archetypes to add to certain settings or to fill a particular gap that might have been lacking. The problem with them though is that they can be a bit overwhelming. It's hard to not open the Cleric page on D&D Beyond and not be like, well damn. Now imagine if you're a new player. The other big advantage of subclasses are that it fairly easily lets you spread around the design themes and flavors across different classes in the game. Like we mentioned earlier, if you wanted to play with psionics, you can now do that with a fighter, a rogue, or a sorcerer. The downside though is that you can't really do that with anything else. In an effort to counteract that though, in the recent Scion UA, we did see a collection of feats that have been created to allow for other classes to get a taste of psionics, however limited. So all this comes together to then once again ask the question of whether or not 5e needs new classes. They've been pretty firmly settled on this subclass approach for over a decade, and with only exactly the one class, the Artificer, that's been added, why would they change now? Or why are we even talking about this? Since the start of 2025, we've had not just one, but two Unearthed Arcanas released for new classes, the Artificer and the Scion. Admittedly, basically everyone expected a revamp to the Artificer for the 2024 rules, but the Scion certainly came out of left field. What's interesting though is that Unearthed Arcana today, in 2025, is fundamentally different than it was in 2016 and around there. Previously, things in UA felt like genuine tests. You would see them show up and they may try a version or two of something, but it was still always a mystery whether or not that thing would actually end up eventually being published. This, however, is not really the case anymore. Since probably 2020 or so, maybe even a little bit earlier, basically everything that we see enter UA ends up being published in some form. It may have been tweaked or changed, but it kind of just shows up anyway. This signals that UA is less about evaluating the viability of something and more about gauging feedback on iterations. The one glaring outlier to this were the Strixhaven subclasses, which still did show up but just as backgrounds. But the idea that they were experimenting with was subclasses that worked for multiple classes, and that obviously did not survive, but it sort of did in a sense given that backgrounds can be chosen by anyone. There was also the Ardling from the first 1D&D UA that did get cut, but even Jeremy Crawford at the time heavily implied that it is going to show up again someday. This is a stark contrast to how UA seemed to function in the mid-2010s, where, like I said, even the Mystic document contained text establishing that it was really about checking to see whether psionics are a good fit at all in 5e. The Scion UA contains no such text. Now obviously the design team has ultimately decided that psionics do work well in 5e, as we saw 3 published subclasses in the 2024 Player's Handbook, but based on recent trend data, I would bet that we will see the Scion published in an upcoming book at some point, and not just entirely scrapped like used to be the case with a lot of UA. I want to be clear at this point that the apparent shift in the intent of UA is largely a factor of 5e's maturity. The team has a fairly good grasp on what works and what doesn't, and more cynically, what sells. It's likely that UA and playtesting just occupies a spot much later in the development cycle than it once did because of all of these things. Now, a few days ago, I asked you all in a community post whether or not you think 5e needs new classes, and at the time of writing this, with about 2,200 votes, 68% said yes. That's pretty high. Honestly, it was higher than I was expecting it to be. Now, if you were to ask me, and someone did during my recent livestream, which was largely the impetus for this video, I would say that I like the idea of new classes, but they need to serve a true purpose. They need to have a genuine flavor or mechanic or reason for being other than to just satisfy their own existence. The Scion, for me, does not reach that bar, at least not in its current implementation. It feels like they very easily could have just been a bard or wizard subclass. They gave it spellcasting, which I truly don't think was something that it needed, and it felt like it was granted just to bolster up some otherwise uninspired design. If a new class is going to exist, I want it to do something that actually can't be done yet in the game, or take something that does exist and crank it up to 11. The problem that the 5e design team is facing with this though, is that because of how generally useful spellcasting is, and how many subclasses exist in the game, it's becoming increasingly difficult to fulfill a truly unique niche anymore. Though it's certainly not to say that it's impossible, as plenty of other third-party creators have done exactly that. Instead, it feels like the designers are just a bit too scared to push the envelope because it's all an unknown quantity. They don't want to throw in a core class that casts spells exclusively using spell points or something in case it's either totally busted or just a waste of paper that it's printed on, and that's left them to instead largely recycle some ideas. A bit more than a year ago, during a panel, Chris Perkins, as reported on by Games Radar, actually said that if he were to go back in time to 2012 when they were initially conceptualizing 5th edition, that he would have made a much stronger push to the return of 4 core classes. He questions why a barbarian couldn't have just been a subclass of a fighter, and how unless you actually know specifically what's going on in D&D, what is separating a sorcerer from a wizard? At a surface level, it isn't immediately obvious, and that leaves many players confused. And the reality is that a lot of these classes could just be subclasses of each other. In fact, even in 1st edition AD&D, paladins and rangers were subclasses of fighters, druids were subclasses of clerics, and the magic user had the most generic name imaginable, the magic user, which enabled further specialization like what we saw with the illusionist. One of my patrons and friend of the channel, Crimson Witch, and host of the Crimson Fox Games YouTube channel, has actually been doing a ton of work to condense and refine all of the 5e classes, not just down to 4, but also restructuring the level span to 10 rather than 20 to make all aspects of the game feel more playable. It's an ambitious project, but it's been really cool to see. The question now bouncing around in my head is that with the departure of Chris Perkins and Jeremy Crawford, and many of the quote-unquote old guard and architects of 5e, is the current team more willing to branch out and try new things, such as the implementation of new classes? Now, I want to be clear, lead times and development cycles are long, way longer than most players probably realize. Both Jeremy and Chris undoubtedly knew about and had some hand in the development of both the revised 2024 Artificer and the Scion. In fact, the Artificer was still released while they were both employed at Wizards of the Coast. The Scion, though, was not. Part of me wonders whether or not it would have been scrapped entirely if it had not been for their departure, or if it was always intended to be released regardless. But I'm not sure that that's a question we'll ever really get an answer to. What I am very curious to see though, is whether or not we will continue to have new core class concepts tested, or if they're just putting this out to gauge reactions to get some estimates on what sales figures might look for an upcoming Psionics themed book. I'll reiterate my stance. I would love to see new classes, even in a game saturated with subclasses. I just want to make sure that there is a genuine reason for their existence and that they're bringing something truly new to the table. Otherwise, just make a subclass or some feats and call it a day. So let me know what you think about new classes, subclasses, and what direction you think D&D might be taking for the future, or what direction you want them to take. Check out some of my other videos, but otherwise, take care.